You're listening to Health Professional Radio. My name is Wayne Buckler, and this is a Health Academy, our regular look at what's happening in the academic world. And my guest today is Dr. Ajeet Singh. Now, Ajeet is with the Geelong Clinic and Deakin University School of Medicine, where he's a psychiatrist. Welcome to Health Professional Radio, Ajeet.
Thanks for speaking with me.
It's a pleasure to have you on. Now, tell us what's been getting your interest lately in the research world.
Well, I've developed a very strong interest in what seems to be a very accelerating area at the moment, genetically guided prescribing, also referred to as precision medicine. And my interest began really out of a clinical need. So I became a psychiatrist back in 2005. And after about a year of working in practice, it was increasingly apparent to me that the way we prescribe medications for people that need them was very much a trial and error process. And this sort of got me interested in seeing if there were ways of reducing trial and error. And at that stage, it was still relatively early days at investigating whether genetic variants could help predict who needed which medication at which dose. So that began really a several-year, process, doing research, getting a doctorate, all about trying to answer a clinical problem. And it's a problem that still affects a lot of patients globally, and it's why it's still a strong passion of mine.
Now, it is the case, I think, isn't it, that a lot of psychiatric prescribing is really about trying something and looking to avoid unpleasant side effects.
Yeah, so I'm sort of based in a private practice setting, and essentially what we deal with is people suffering with severe depression. Happily, there's a great many people when they have issues with depression who get major dividends from lifestyle modification or psychological counselling. But there's a group of people who have more severe, persisting and handicapping cases of depression who'll present for help. And essentially the process is, out of a collection of 15 to 20 odd medications, there's a trial and error process to see which medication works best for an individual. Sometimes you get a hole in one, and the first medication at the first dose really makes a difference. Sometimes it can take years. Equally, there's a group of patients where medications won't be the be-all and the end-all, and other issues, be it damage from their childhood or too much stress in their life now, require focus upon.
Now, this is not a quick process with psychiatric medicines either, is it? You can't treat it like an aspirin and take it now and get an effect in 30 minutes' time.
No, so one of the issues is the way we think these medications work. It's quite tricky. So it seems to take at least a few weeks for them to begin to alter brain chemistry. And the exact mechanism of how they work is unclear, I think reflecting just how complex the human brain is. But basically all you can discern in the first week is if somebody's getting side effects. And then basically just tell them to, reduce the dose or stop it. But it takes at least a month to get a good signature of if they're going to improve. And it can take up to 3 months to see if they recover. And part of this drawn-out process is the antidepressants seem to alter chemical balances that can enable brain pathways to connect more strongly. A lot of people might have heard of neuroplasticity, this idea that the brain is not locked in, it can actually recover. And this process can take a few months. So the big issue with depression pills is you might start something and it might be a month before you know whether it's working. And you can see how very quickly 6 or 12 months can pass if you're having to trial and error through a different set of pills or different doses.
So being able to more accurately predict what medications are going to work with which individuals is obviously a big advantage. What was the results of your research? Where are we at?
So there's been medical research is a process, and the earlier phases were association studies where there wasn't a comparison between genetically guided prescribing and traditional non-guided prescribing. And the problem with associations is there's all sorts of factors that could mediate any seeming outcome. So there were no firm conclusions. Recently I've done work comparing whether genetically guided prescribing improves outcomes more than non-guided prescribing. And in the group I looked at, we had a nearly doubling of the recovery rate over 12 weeks. And the methods that I took was looking at how we differ in our liver enzyme genetics and also genetics at the blood-brain barrier. So early on in my career, I got the impression the brain itself was really tricky. So I tried to figure out kind of like the box that it comes in. And a surprising thing about the brain is it's covered in this wrapping or membrane called the blood-brain barrier, which prevents medications getting in generally. Mm-hmm. And so it's really looking at gene variants at that step as well as at the liver. Pretty much when you swallow a pill, most of it gets knocked out by your liver before it enters the bloodstream. And then the fraction that gets into the bloodstream, only a fraction of that can cross into the brain because of this blood-brain barrier. So they've been the specific things that I've focused on in my work.
You're listening to the Health Academy with Health Professional Radio. My name's Wayne Buckler and I'm in conversation with Dr. Ajeet Singh, who's a private psychiatrist and an academic with the Geelong Clinic and the Deakin University School of Medicine. We've been talking about prescribing and genetics. Now, Ajeet, is genetics at a point where it is sufficiently detailed to be predictive?
So I think the big news in the last 5 years has been the exponential reduction in costs. So people can sort of remember back to around 2003 when the Human Genome Project was completed, where they could do the DNA sequence of one whole person. That cost about $3 billion US.
Petty cash, really, just petty cash.
That's right. As of last year, the same thing can be done for US $1,000. As of this week, a single gene variant can be analysed for $50 US commercially.
Wow.
So what's happened is the price point has really got low, and this is turbocharging not only commercial interest, but research. So often researchers are faced with very tight budgets and competition for grants. And what we're seeing is a big inflection upswing in the amount of clinical research being done, particularly comparing genetically guided prescribing to non-guided prescribing to see if this new method actually has real-world merit or not.
Now, even at $50, what's involved in getting a gene study done? Is this a complex process for an individual?
So essentially, you can either give a blood sample or just a spit sample. And so a lot of the research I've done has been just really from spit samples, which you can collect in your office without any needles, or people can go to their usual lab and get a blood test. And then there are certain companies that manufacture things called gene chips. So basically what's happening now is lots of labs globally have access to these sequencing machines. They just put your sample in this little chip, plug it into the machine, and then they get a result of your DNA profile. So things have sort of reached that level of mass production and simplicity.
That's an astonishing reduction in both cost and complexity in a very short period of time, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think this is, often we become zealous about the area we're interested in, and you can be lost in your own little world. But earlier this year, what got a lot of attention was Barack Obama's State of the Union address. So in January this year, the one area of science technology he highlighted was precision medicine, this genetically guided prescribing. And a lot of the work has been done on genetically guided cancer treatment prescribing to get better survival, but it's also crossing over into all domains of medicine, including antidepressant prescribing. And that was seen as a sort of lead indicator that this area is accelerating, and he pledged $250 million with bipartisan support to accelerate research in the area. He's pledged to have 1 million Americans genotyped, have their whole genome done. The UK government last year pledged to do that for 100,000 people. So it seems that we've got a transatlantic race at the moment with the UK and the USA leading the frontier.
And has your work reached the point where it's something you can use in practice at this point?
So I'd say the evidence base at the moment, in my view, is suitable for early adopters. For a level of evidence to reach routine prescribing guidelines, there needs to be replicated, repeated randomised controlled trials. And so the evidence is not at that point yet. But in the pipeline at the moment, just in the antidepressant genetically guided prescribing, there are multiple randomised controlled trials in the pipeline. And I'm anticipating by the end of next year, we should see if we've got replicated, repeated randomised controlled trials coming through. At that point, I predict genetically guided prescribing will actually start to enter prescribing guidelines. It already has in psychiatry for one medication called carbamazepine. This is a medication used in epilepsy, but it's also used in bipolar disorders. And there's a side effect called Stevens-Johnson syndrome. It's a catastrophic skin reaction, which is more common in people with an Asian ethnicity. And so if people of an Asian ethnicity have a $50 genetic test, we can predict if they're at a very high risk of that reaction or not and make prescribing decisions. So that's just entered routine prescribing guidelines, and I think it's the first wave of what's going to be a trend of genetically guided prescribing entering guidelines. But again, that evidence needs to be more mature.
And I guess, Ajeet, given that the way you described some of the prescribing process as being trial and error to begin with, you don't need to have a very strong rationale for spending $50 if it's going to improve what is really a random process anyway.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things is also it's one test per lifetime. So it's not like getting repeated liver function tests. Once you get your genotype, hopefully it doesn't change over time. So that also makes it attractive. I think the other thing is, as the world faces lots of budget pressures, often new medical technology equals greater healthcare costs. With genetically guided prescribing, we could take out enormous amounts of waste from the system. And this is an example of a technology that could actually reduce total health spend. I think this is another reason why government is accelerating this area of work.
Yes, that's the fact it's a once a lifetime test is a thought that just hadn't occurred to me. Is there a downside that you see?
I think one of the traps early in any new medical technology is there can be people making claims way ahead of the evidence, either through commercial or academic ambition. And that's something which regulators have to try and manage. And earlier this year, the FDA announced that they're actually going to start to monitor companies offering genetic tests to make sure that they've got some robust evidence behind their claims. There had been a little bit of cowboy territory where companies were saying we've got a genetic test for XYZ, but in fact the science behind it was very flimsy. And I think now governments are starting to regulate the space. It'll actually enhance the space because more credible tests will come through.
Yes, it's an exciting time, but anywhere you get an exciting time, you get a little bit of gold rush fever, and there are always edges to be worried about.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I often sort of, reflect, what's my core role? And my role is to serve my patients. And so if we figure out better ways of helping people that are robustly empirically demonstrated, that's the pathway forward. If we end up jumping the gun and exposing people to methods that might not be in their best interests, we actually go against that core intent as medical practitioners of trying to get optimal outcomes for our patients.
You're listening to Health Professional Radio. My name is Wayne Buckler, And this is the Health Academy, our regular look at research and what's happening within the academic world. My guest today is Dr. Ajeet Singh. Ajeet's a psychiatrist and an academic at both the Geelong Clinic and the Deakin University School of Medicine. Now, Ajeet, I noticed recently in some research about you that you've been competing. I see that you're a semi-finalist in a biotech startup competition. Tell us about that.
Yes, I've kind of stepped out of my comfort zone. And so I think often what happens in medical practice and academic medicine is we can sort of, particularly at least in Australia, be at very arm's length to industry. But recently I've been reflecting on translational medicine, the concept of getting an idea, getting science to changing clinical practice. And I think one of the translational gaps is appropriate medical entrepreneurialism. I think a lot of medical practitioners consider entrepreneurialism something to avoid, but I've made a deliberate decision to see whether we can't get an evidence-based genetic guidance report system up and running, clearly indicating the strengths and limits of the evidence and that it's in the early adoption phase. And with that in mind, I entered a competition, a biotechnology startup competition in Melbourne, and got a lot further than I anticipated as a novice. But it was a great opportunity to learn a little bit about the different kind of language and thinking needed to actually birth something into reality beyond the academic alone.
And are you in a position to tell us what that idea was now, or is it still secret and commercially sensitive?
No, so basically the idea is similar to as we discussed before, is looking at gene variants at both liver enzymes and the blood-brain barrier to guide the antidepressant prescribing. And it really comes off the clinical trial which I've run, the evidence of that, and then making that available. But I'm very anxious that it's not misrepresented and that people visiting the website will be able to see that it's based on this evidence and to have a dialogue with their doctor. I think one of the traps is anything that undermines the doctor-patient relationship, I think, can backfire. And I'm hoping to make this available, but in a way that's sort of enshrined in the safeguards of the doctor-patient relationship, might help bring the technology forward somewhat.
Now, your clinical and academic conservatism here is completely at odds with the entrepreneurial IT world, where you must overhype this, present it as being able to do everything from stop world hunger to colonise Mars, and talk up the initial offering on the stock market. So I'm going to have to give you lessons in how to do that, I think, Ajeet.
Yeah, well, I'm a believer that great products sell, and maybe I'm employing reverse psychology.
Perhaps you're well qualified to do that. Ajeet, one of my favourite questions is about what's coming over the horizon. Have you been looking, if you take off your conservative glasses for a moment and you look at where the next few years might be going, what's the big thing you think in your area?
I think in the future, getting your whole genome sequence will be so cheap that people will have the option of having it at birth or across entire populations. And I think if it's used properly, it'll give people a heads up on conditions they're at above average risk of, which at one level could inflate anxiety, but at another level could give people an opportunity to intensify preventative and screening measures. So I could see a future where we'd know if we're at elevated risk of certain conditions, be they mental health, cancers, other conditions, and then an opportunity to intensify preventative and screening opportunities. So I actually see a lot of good arising from the precision medicine space and genetics in general.
It'll be interesting to see what the future brings in that area. Ajeet, it's been my pleasure to have you on this morning because it's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you for joining us on the Health Academy on Health Professional Radio.
Yes, it's been a privilege, and I thank you for the time.
Oh, my pleasure. If you've just joined us, well, then you've just missed out on a fascinating conversation with Dr. Ajeet Singh, a psychiatrist and academic from the Geelong Clinic and the Deakin University School of Medicine. However, the good news is on our website we have a transcript at www.hpr.fm, and there's an audio archive both on SoundCloud and on YouTube. My name's Wayne Buckler. This is the Health Academy on Health Professional Radio.